All right, it looks like people are starting to connect to the audio here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jacob Hagstrom, Assistant Professor of History at the Citadel. It's my honor today to introduce the speakers for this timely event, as we recently passed the one-year mark of Russia's war in Ukraine. It's especially timely because within the last 2 weeks, President Biden's administration renewed its public condemnation of Russian war crimes, used as the rationale for yet another round of economic sanctions on Putin's government. So, does the history of Eastern Europe in particular help explain what's happening today in Ukraine? And does military history writ large have any lessons? To help us consider, we have here Dr. David Frey, who earned his PhD at Columbia University in New York. Just up the Hudson River at West Point, he is now professor of history and founding director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. In 2018, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum named Dr. Frey one of 7 international agents of change, and hopefully today he will help us to change or add to the ways that we think about atrocities during wartime today. The organizer of this event is Dr. Chad Gibbs. He earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and he's the director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies and assistant professor of Jewish studies at the College of Charleston. He's also an affiliated researcher at USC's Shoah Foundation. Prior to his academic career, Dr. Gibbs served in the 101st Airborne Division of the US Army, service which included a deployment to Iraq. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gibbs. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. Well, I wanted to thank Dr. David Frey and Dr. Jacob Hagstrom for joining us today. I think this will be a really great opportunity for our students and the community members who attend to hear from David Frey, and to address the questions that bring us together today. So with that said, I'll just ask a first question and let David take things away. So the first question I have for you today to start off this conversation is just why is it valuable to think about the war in Ukraine through an atrocities prevention or atrocities analysis lens?
So Dr. Gibbs, Dr. Hagstrom, thank you very much for inviting me and for being willing to allow me to answer some of these questions. I am up here in New York, where we actually had our first taste of winter. There's 8 inches of snow on the ground. It's been fantastic. At least we remember what it was. And I want to start the way I have to start almost all of my presentations. I have to say that the opinions I'm about to give are mine and mine alone. They don't represent those of the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or any other government organization. That said, I'm going to talk about a little bit about governments, and in particular, probably the Russian government. When we think about atrocity prevention, there are a couple things that atrocity prevention and the atrocity prevention lens allows us to do. It allows us to kind of think about the intentions and motives of the actors and why they're doing what they're doing, not just what they're doing. It also gets us thinking about kind of the long-term reasons for action. And what I mean by that is it gets us thinking about not just the historical, but the systemic. And I'm going to come back to some of this idea of the systemic, I hope, as we discuss these issues further. But when we think about the war in Ukraine, the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine, we can look at it through an atrocity prevention lens, which gets us thinking about why the war occurred, not just why it occurred, but why it occurred when it did. And first, for example, it gets us thinking about the long-term Russian grievances since the fall of the Soviet Union that we may have paid less attention to. Second, there were a lot of things that Putin said in a number of things that he produced in 2020 and 2021, which we should have paid more attention to. For example, some of the imperial nationalist concepts that he was enunciating in his versions of history that he published. And many of us in the West kind of poo-pooed this until the invasion, and we should have taken that a little bit more seriously. But what we also should think about are the nature of atrocities is that they generally occur, in mass atrocities, they generally occur in ongoing conflicts. And Ukraine had an ongoing conflict, so it was not a surprise, and it's not a surprise that we saw and have continued to see some of these things. An atrocity prevention lens also gets us thinking about these long-term reasons as to why the atrocity crimes, and again, I think probably we'll talk about that more and define that more, and war crimes are occurring. And one of the reasons that we will probably come back to is this issue of legal accountability. The Russian legal system and the Russian military system are not designed to provide for accountability. In fact, the Russian system itself is designed in a way which almost rewards, in fact, in some cases has rewarded atrocious behavior. The use of military proxies, we've seen that in Ukraine since the first invasion, right? We saw the Little Green Men in 2014, and the Wagner Group, which has played a prominent role in the current conflict, and the idea of kind of outsourcing responsibility for military action, whether it was in Bosnia, in Darfur, elsewhere, we have seen proxies become very involved in atrocious behavior. And there are, I think, reasons for that, not the least being that they are outside of normal constitutional control. I don't know if people are familiar with the term anocracy, but the term anocracy is the term that political scientists use to define that kind of space in between democracy and authoritarianism. So when a democracy is moving towards authoritarian rather substantially, or an authoritarian regime is moving away or towards democracy, there is that period of time in between when and kind of nether situation in between, where there could be a lot of fighting over whether or not that democracy is for a particular group of people or for all people, control of that democracy, and that we often see that associated with higher risk of mass atrocities. And I would argue that that Russia is actually, despite the fact that it is seemingly more authoritarian, there is a level of instability there, and there is a movement towards that kind of looks anocratic, and that makes Russia more prone to atrocity. So, in addition to thinking about many other warning signs that we could discuss, in particular existentialist rhetoric, but I think I'll get back to that as we talk further. There are some other elements of kind of the atrocity prevention lens. I mentioned that the idea that it gets us thinking about why atrocities occur, and why certain actions are taken. And often I get asked, and others talk about this idea of the Russian way of war, or are Russians, are they just evil? Or is that why they are committing these crimes? Mm-hmm. And you and I both know, as we teach genocide, we teach the Holocaust, when people use the term evil and the term good, those are kind of moral poles. And generally, they don't require explanation. If you dismiss someone as evil or crazy or bad, then that answers the question as to why they're acting the way they are. Not using those terms is what atrocity prevention actually allows us to do, and to kind of get us into the intentions and the imperatives for why people act, and not dehumanize people by saying that the Russians are somehow just bad people. They always do this. They always act this particular way. That gets us away from actually understanding and trying to then create opportunities to mitigate, or opportunities to provide disincentives for action to get people to act better, which is the ultimate goal of an atrocity prevention lens. So stopping or mitigating atrocity, allowing us to think about long-term issues like trauma, recovery, justice, accountability, different impacts on different genders. This is what an atrocity prevention lens does. And it also could, by using it, it can help us to prevent retaliation. Right? If the Ukrainians understand the purposefully provocative methods that the Russians are using, and I think they have done a fairly reasonable job at this, and we know that they're acting in particular ways in order to create conditions that then in a way rationalize their atrocious behavior. And by they, I mean the Russians. The Ukrainians can short circuit that in a way, circumvent it to make by not responding in particular ways. So, and then this atrocity prevention also can help us understand why Putin was using the information space that he did. I started by mentioning his discussions of imperialism, but one of the things that he has done within Russia has really framed this conflict from the get-go as an existentialist conflict. The conflict is not against Ukraine, it's against Satanists, it's against evil, it's against NATO that wants to destroy Russia, that there is no choice. The world brought him into this conflict. He didn't cause it. That this kind of discussion it becomes more obvious why he's making it when you view things through an atrocity prevention lens than if we're just doing a typical analysis.
Thanks. I think that gives us a spot maybe for a little bit of a step back to consider the term atrocity. So maybe one of the things I'm adding on to this question as you were talking was, is the war itself as a war of aggression the first place to think about what an atrocity is? Does the war itself count as an atrocity? And our discussion is in fact called Russia's Army and the Commission of Atrocities. So just maybe for those perhaps not following the war closely or familiar or maybe unfamiliar with the term and its legal definitions, could you maybe explain for us what the concept of battlefield atrocities or violations of the law of warfare are?
Sure. So I'll first start by kind of defining what atrocities or mass atrocities, atrocity crimes are. So there are three definite categories and maybe a fourth that's a debated category. So the crime of genocide and an offensive war actually comes under that crime of genocide. It also comes under other crimes. So just the fact that that Russia has invaded a sovereign state, that's really something that is new and different, and why the stakes are so high since at least the breakup of the Soviet Union. Obviously that it happened many times before that, but this is one of the reasons why I believe there's so much at stake in this war. Second, in addition to this crime of genocide, war crimes count as crimes as mass atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, and the debated category is simply ethnic cleansing. The 2005 there was a World Congress that the responsibility to protect came out of this UN organized conference, and they declared ethnic cleansing as a mass atrocity crime. Now, the one issue with that is that ethnic cleansing is not a legal category. There's no law that actually defines ethnic cleansing. It's fairly, and by cleansing, we should use air quotes around that. It's the forced removal of people from a territory of a defined group of people. So those are the atrocity crimes, and there's a lot of overlap between them, and that leads us to these ideas of what you asked about the law of war and law of armed conflict. So murder, torture, forced population movements, destruction of schools and hospitals, destruction of cultural sites and cultural objects. These are all crimes in a variety of different categories. But when it comes to thinking about kind of battlefield crimes, a different set of law applies, right? We're talking about the something you had to know and Jacob had to know, the law of armed conflict, right? Or the law of warfare, land warfare. And there are four basic principles to that. The first is distinction or discrimination. And what that means is that you have to differentiate between those that are military and those that are non-military. And so you're not supposed to shoot at people who are unarmed civilians. You can shoot legally at people who are armed and in uniform. So that discrimination or distinction has to occur. Second is proportionality, and that would mean that if proverbially through the ether or the cyber ether you poked me in the chest, I can't respond with a nuclear weapon, right? That is disproportionate. I might poke you back, but that would be proportionate, but that's it. Military necessity is the third of these principles, meaning that that a target or something that you are fighting against needs to be something of military necessity, part of an operation that makes sense. So if you are attacking a village, you can shoot at the places where there are military units. If there's collateral damage, that's allowed, but if you purposely target a hospital when there's no military units there, that doesn't fit the standard of military necessity. And then the final category is, or principle, is unnecessary suffering. You're not supposed to fight in ways that cause unnecessary suffering, and there have been a lot of types of munitions, for example, that have been outlawed based on this principle. And the Russians, for example, are, and there's some argument about the Ukrainians and the types of mines that they're using, landmines that they're using, but the Russians, for example, are using thermite weapons and or their thermobaric weapons that that can cause both significant burns or cause a pressure wave, which causes unnecessary suffering. The use of flechettes or what do they call the weapons? The ones that have, now I'm forgetting the term.
Is it a cluster? I thought you were
Cluster
going
munitions,
cluster
exactly.
munitions,
Thank you. I forgot. So cluster munitions, those are generally thought to cause unnecessary suffering and are not the kinds of things that should be used, but they are being used. And so those are hopefully that explains or answers your questions about the basic ideas of what are these violations. Now, of course, there are violations like torture. The Russians have been shown to capture Ukrainians and then to torture them. They've even tortured their own people who have either resisted going to the front or who have been returned as prisoners of war. We've seen that with the Wagner group in particular. And so that obviously is a war crime, as well as a crime against humanity. I don't know if you return someone who is no longer under arms, it probably counts as a crime against humanity. So there are a lot of those things going on. Cultural destruction, purposeful cultural destruction, the destruction of churches, the removal of historical items, the burning of archives, all of these kinds of things are being practiced by the Russians. So those wouldn't be war crimes per se, but they would be crimes of genocide or crimes that are part of this nexus of ethnic cleansing.
Can I add something from the coverage of this war that kind of has been really important since we planned this event? So I ask you to comment on, is it an atrocity in the way that we've just been describing this to attack infrastructure in the way that has been going on, the power grid specifically? And then could you comment maybe further in that, is that against the law of warfare if perhaps Russia could make some excuse of there being a munitions factory on the same power grid. Is it still an atrocity to attack that grid in total, or is that a form of justification that could be used?
That's a great question. Thank you. I would say that this is where things get murky, and this is why you do need lawyers in terms of in ways that we use them generally in the U.S. Army, but they are far less likely to be used in the Russian sense. They don't have a JAG Corps that advises on targeting in the same way we do. So in quick answer to your question, even though I'm not at all an expert on these kinds of legal issues, in the 1949 Geneva Conventions did outlaw the kind of warfare to some extent that we fought in World War II. So the idea of strategic bombing, where you just bomb everything, that no longer was legal after 1949. We needed to do, and especially as weapons systems have improved, the idea of being able to more accurately target it is not legal simply to attack water supplies or attack the entire electrical grids in order to try to kind of damage the morale of the opposing side. Now, that's not to say that that Western states didn't do that. They practiced some of that kind of warfare in some of the wars of independence of colonies. That doesn't make it any less of a crime. It still is a crime. Now, can it be justified for purposes of targeting if you can say that we are attacking a specific grid that supplies a munitions factory that is right next door to it? That's probably something that would not end up being a discussion in a post-conflict trial. Now, that's also part of the key and part of the frustration for much of this, is that we could declare everything under the sun as a war crime or crime of genocide. And in fact, the Ukrainian prosecutor has 65,000 cases at this point of at least of what seem to be credible charges that fit one of these categories of atrocious crimes. And whether what comes to trial, who comes to trial, that's always been the problem with atrocity prevention. And that's certainly the problem in Russia, is the lack of legal accountability and the politicization of the legal system that makes it highly unlikely, without regime change, that the planners of this will ever be brought to justice.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to follow that up by asking, I'm trying to understand if we should view Russia's commission of the atrocities that we're talking about as the result of doctrine or of a broken system. And I'll back up in my question there for the audience, especially maybe for my students, to explain the difference between doctrine, or what doctrine is, and what I mean by a broken system. So maybe the easiest way to explain for the audience is that doctrine, there are the two largest commands in the U.S. Army, the Training and Doctrine Command and then Forces Command. You learn what you're supposed to do when you're under training and doctrine. Doctrine is the how we are supposed to do things side of things. And then you're put into Forces Command to go do things. If I can put that any simpler, I don't know how to do it. But can you maybe speak to whether what Russia does, or what we're seeing Russia do or be accused of, are the results of what they're trained to do, or the result of a broken system?
Mm-hmm. So I think when we think about what doctrine is, and this it's principle, right? It's the principles that behind the application of force. When should we use it? How should we use it, as you said, and why do we use it? And so to answer your question, I think I'll answer it as a typical history professor, which is, you're right, both. And so both things are the reasons for the atrocities that we're seeing. It's partly the result of a broken system and partly the result of doctrine. And this gets me into the discussion of kind of the systemic reasons for why I think atrocities are occurring so frequently in this war and are practiced by the Russians. So first, I think the Russian army is nowhere near what we thought it was. We thought it had modernized. We thought that it had become more professional, and to some extent it may have. But I think what happened in the first part of this war is that an enormous number of trained officers were killed. Of the newest officers were killed. So the young lieutenants and captains, maybe majors, they're the ones in the field leading the troops. They may have been the more professional and more modernized, and they were decimated. And I think we can't understate the importance of that. The second part of this is that this wasn't entirely just a military operation. It involved the Russian equivalent of the National Guard. It involves, as we already talked about, the Wagner group, and it involved groups like from the Chechens and elsewhere that were almost separate organizations that were pasted together. And so that, to some extent, is a systemic problem, but it's also a problem of doctrine, and I'll get to that. There are, I think, a couple of different, in fact, more than a couple, many different reasons for why the Russians have done what they have done in Ukraine. The first has to do with, I think, demography. This is one thing that we don't necessarily think about, but if we look at Russian demography, since at the end of World War II, despite the enormous Russian losses, the US and Russian population were approximately the same, about, I think about 140, 150 million. That went up for a little while in Russia, but now it's gone down. It's actually back to about 150 million, and it is supposed to decline, and this war has accelerated the decline, not just in terms of the number of people who have been killed, but also the number of people who have fled. So there, by some accounts, we've got about 1 million or so people who have fled, mostly young males of technical ability and trained, reasonably well off, and exactly the most productive people in a society that you want to have. Second is that in the right at the end of the Soviet period and the beginning of the post-Soviet period, there was an enormous decline in reproduction. And part of that makes sense, that it's a period of instability and uncertainty. And when you don't know what the future brings, you are far less likely to have children. And that age group would be approximately 30 today. That's exactly the age group that you would draw from as you're drafting and conscripting, and that's a place where the Russians have a shortage. So they have an increasingly aging population, and if Putin waits another 5 years, then he has even fewer people to draw from. So one of the reasons that some scholars have argued that it's been so difficult for him to do the mass draft that he's trying is that simply the base number of men doesn't exist. It also helps to explain why he's gone beyond kind of to the Russian periphery, to the poorer areas of the Russian Federation, where there are people with far fewer choices and far less ability to leave. Second is, I think there are elements of doctrine. So the Russians redid their doctrine. They have what they're calling kind of a hybrid warfare, which isn't really doctrine, it's just an idea. But they do have doctrine that creates everything from procurement to force formations, to recruitment, training, all of this. Those are the kinds of things that doctrine shapes. And one of the the changes that they brought about in the modernization of the Army is that they created these combat battalions, and the combat battalion group, though they theoretically have abandoned them now. The combat battalion group was a formation that was designed to bring together basically all of the support systems and everything you need into one battalion. That includes your fuel, that includes your medics, that includes your anti-aircraft protection, that includes all your logistics chain and everything. So that would all be under the command of one, generally a colonel or the equivalent of a colonel. And that didn't work because it was so complicated, and also because they were so understaffed. So this is where kind of doctrine meets broken, to get back to your question. So the doctrine was to create these organizations and to train some of the officers to do this, but they were systemically understaffed. So while they were supposed to be units of 700 to 900, in many cases they were down by 200 to 300. And if you don't have enough people to actually staff the unit as planned, then you don't have people trained to do the jobs that they need to do. And if it's a combined arms unit, it makes it awfully hard to do combined arms operations if you don't have people trained to do it. I think a great example of where these failures occurred and how understaffing showed these failures is that each one of these units was supposed to have 3 infantry rifle companies. A company is approximately, an American company is at least approximately 120 people. And that means 360 people were supposed to be trained as infantry, dismounted infantry. And that was not the case in almost any of these units that were lined up before the invasion. And so if you remember that long 40-mile train of tanks and weaponry that was headed towards Kyiv and got destroyed, well, one of the reasons it got destroyed was that while you had a lot of equipment, you had drivers for the armored personnel carriers, for the tanks. You didn't have people in the armored personnel carriers to actually dismount and create the protective cordons around your big convoy. And as a result, the Ukrainians were able to get close enough with very small groups of people with the shoulder-mounted anti-tank weapons and just pick off these tanks and other vehicles. And so that's where kind of the doctrine, the mess of doctrine, met the mess of the unit, or of the Russian army. Another example that I would give is systemic corruption. So corruption up top, the arms contractors are all obviously in Putin's circle. They're friends of Putin, and you have to be, and he keeps you there by providing you contracts. But your incentive is just to make a lot of money and to put as little of what the contract requires you to put into the weaponry. So the weaponry looked good, but that didn't mean that it functioned. And because the Russians had tried to downsize the size of their army, but increase its capacity, what do you ignore when you do that? You ignore maintenance, or you hire that maintenance out. Again, corruption. People fill out the form saying, yes, I maintained that tank, without actually maintaining the tank. And so then when it comes to its need and its use, it doesn't work. The corruption goes all the way down to, and this was all aggravated, by the way, by sitting out in the cold Belarusian and Russian winter for a couple of months before the actual invasion. But the corruption went all the way down to the level of the private in the army. So, for example, as the invading force was lined up before they actually knew they were going to invade, and I'll get to that momentarily, there are all kinds of examples of soldiers actually selling their food, their MREs, some of their equipment, their munitions, and a lot of their fuel. So another reason why that convoy failed is because if you're on a single lane road and somebody runs out of gas, you're stuck. And so then when you can't move, you become a sitting duck. So again, these are some of the systemic problems that when you have corruption from the top and when you have corruption from the bottom. This is tied to another systemic problem, which is lack of trust. The commanders don't trust the people giving them orders, and you saw evidence of that where the part of the reason that so many high-ranking, so many general officers have been killed is that they didn't trust that their subordinates were actually issuing the orders that they were giving them. And so they had to go to the front to actually deliver the orders themselves, and they put themselves in harm's way and often were killed. Some estimates are as the lowest estimate I've seen is 11 general officers killed. The highest is over 15. And so when you lose that many people with that rank, that also has long-term damage for your military. That trust is at every echelon. So, and the way reward happens in the Russian army is you're rewarded for obedience, not for success. And so, that's that's a systemic part. That's not necessarily doctrine, but that's a systemic reason, and that's part of the training, which does flow from doctrine. The lack of trust is one of the reasons why the large majority of the forces were not told they were invading until, in some cases, hours before the invasion, because they weren't trusted to keep that information secret, nor did they necessarily even believe it. It also led to complete misunderstandings, both on the part of the senior Russian military and their ideas about what an invasion would look like, and even the folks at the bottom. And I think this is where it becomes tied to atrocity. So there was hubris at the top, the idea that the Ukrainians would simply fold, a misunderstanding of the Ukrainian population, that they were not interested in defending principles of democracy. Then at the bottom, there was the idea that, hey, we're going on an exercise. In some cases, there were troops who were in Ukraine that were never told they were in Ukraine. They were told that they were simply doing an exercise, and they expected, even if they knew that they were invading, to be greeted with forgive the language, and this is not my language, but open arms and open legs. And when they expected that kind of reception, and when they did not get it, they were forceful in forcing that to happen. And so there are sadly examples of that that we have seen, of people with high expectations that they would be greeted as liberators and that they would be celebrated and celebrating. And then when that did not happen, there was dissonance that they tried to overcome with force. What other reasons? Corruption talked about. Oh, one of the issues I think that is important for us to recognize is that Russia has focused on technological improvements, and armies are made up of people. And when you focus on that and you put your resources towards technology, towards these new weapons, that's important, but it's also, if you're taking it from the actual training, from your care of your forces, there are repercussions. And so creating the new tanks, the T-90s, the new hypersonic weapons, that takes a lot of money. And so paying your soldiers becomes less a priority. When paying your soldiers becomes less of a priority, you create a situation where soldiers are much more likely to loot and pillage, especially if you're recruiting them from the poorest parts of your empire. And so there's significant evidence that, and some of this has been established simply by looking at mailing and shipping records from Belarus, that the first part of the war just saw mass looting. And the idea that, hey, I'm in this war so that I can get a new TV, or I'm seeing things in homes that that we don't have in the area that I come from. So I'm just grabbing as much as I can and literally sending it home. And so they would send it through mail systems in Belarus, and we've been able to, there have been some people who have tracked that. I mentioned that I get back to other systemic reasons like the impunity, right? The Russian military does not have a judge advocate system or even a military police system the same way that we do. And more importantly, they don't have an NCO system. And by NCO, for those of you watching, that means the non-commissioned officers. So the way Western armies are generally structured is that you have an officer who is the professional officer, who will move up in terms of authority. But then you have non-commissioned officers whose jobs are basically to maintain order and discipline within the smaller units. And they may rise as well, but generally they, if you become a sergeant, which is the highest non-commissioned rank, or versions of sergeant, it becomes the highest non-commissioned rank, you're still working within a company. And so that system provides long-term control within Western military forces. In other words, a sergeant can be a sergeant for 15, 20 years. I might be wrong exactly on the number, but for a long period of time. And generally they stay in particular units. An officer will rotate, will rise and rotate, and generally not be in a particular unit for more than 2 to 3 years. And so in the Western militaries, at least the description I just gave was of the US Army, but in most Western militaries, you have a strong non-commissioned officer corps whose job it is to keep order and discipline, while the officer thinks about the morale, the tactics, or strategic issues, depending on how high you go. The Russian army doesn't have that. And the Russian army has been doing things like making people sergeants with no training, and maybe 5 days after they were conscripted, and putting them in units. So they have no power. They have no tradition of kind of maintaining order within the unit. I mentioned there's no military police. The military police force in the Russian army was not created until they do have one now. It was created in 2011. And so the people that we normally would have, whose job is in part to maintain order, but also to largely process prisoners of war, or process populations that are under your control when you occupy an area, those they don't really have that. And so they put civilian authorities, or they put other forms of authority, like their secret police forces, who regularly use torture, right? So those kinds of behaviors, again, are not surprising. The training that the Russians have is still quite violent. They've been trying to get rid of that over the last 20 years, but it takes a long time to eliminate cultures of violence. And so the hazing, in some cases, again, I apologize for the term, but like rape as a form of initiation. In 2018, there was a case in which a private who was raped killed his commanding officer and 9 other people in his unit. And so the fact is, this still happens. In this case, it was male on male rape. And so this idea of forced submission, essentially, these are they're I'm sorry to use such rough terms, but these are ways in which the process of conformity is shaped in the Russian army that just aren't acceptable in Western armies today. Not to say that they don't happen, but they are not acceptable. So this social practice, I guess, of atrocious violence, even among the people in the Russian army, so that they are acclimated to this violence, and thus commission of it against others is not seen as something that out of the ordinary, because they have been exposed to that. So finally, this idea of impunity. I've already talked about how there's not an enforcement authority and there's not a legal authority as to kind of both to tell the Russian officers that maybe you shouldn't use that kind of method. And I'm sorry, I forgot a significant kind of doctrinal method. The Russian way of fighting war, as we have seen over the past 30 years, is based on how they train, what they procure, and in a way preserving their force. And one of the ways you do that is you bomb from distance. Either you bomb from the air, or you just lob a lot of artillery, and you preserve your force, because generally the enemy doesn't have a way of getting access to you. So that's how they fought the war in Chechnya. That's how they to some extent, I'll get back to that. That's how they fought in Syria, or how they have fought in Syria. A little less so, but similar to how they fought in Georgia. And so you just lob a lot of bombs at a particular place, and then you hope you don't have to then fight a street-to-street battle. And so they did not train the way some of our armies train for urban warfare. They basically fight urban warfare by reducing everything to rubble and then sending troops and tanks in if necessary. And in this war, they're finding it necessary. And then, the awarding people for atrocious violence. So one of the things that we saw is the rifle brigade that actually committed the atrocities in Bucha. While that was being uncovered and investigated and was in the news, what did Putin do? He raised them to a guard unit, which is an elite level, and he also awarded the entire unit with for meritorious service. And so this is there are other indicators, but this is a great indicator of how you create systems that reward this kind of behavior as opposed to punish it. So I'll take a breath there. I'm sorry, I went on for a long time, but there's a lot tied to doctrine and to brokenness. Yeah.
No, that was so much food for thought. I'm hearing in there a lot of different factors here. I'm just gonna sum a few. The lack of military police, and I think if we could put in that all of the things that it would come with, a form of belief in consequence. If there is no consequence, that feeds into this idea of impunity. The lack of a judge advocate general's court. Just for anybody who didn't watch that cheesy TV show, judge advocate general's court, as in a military law enforcement system that includes judges, lawyers, so on and so forth. So if you have none of that, there is a signal in its absence that criminality could be accepted.
Yeah, let me give you a quick caveat for that. It's not that they don't have it, they have one, but its job is primarily to enforce obedience, not to actually investigate criminal behavior. So the criminal behavior that they do investigate is when someone does not do what they're supposed to do, and so, or if they go AWOL. Those are the things that they they track down, not the crimes against the other the people who you were fighting against.
Right. Thank you for that. So, and I also want to bring in that you said this, well, the terrible fact of sexual violence in this war. First, I think I would want to say, as a scholar of genocide and atrocity, that the world in general waited until only shockingly recently to address the idea of sexual violence as a weapon of war and as a atrocity that needs its own categorization and enforcement mechanisms. But the Russian army is a system where you said rape is a form of initiation, and then these other doctrinal and broken system factors feeding into creating, as you also said, a form of impunity, and perhaps a feeling of being owed or owning something. We just see a lot of a cavalcade, if you will, of problems coming together all at once on the battlefield here. And I will ask you one sort of provocative, you've addressed it so much, but I'll give you the opportunity to use it as your way to wrap up. And then we'll pitch to Jacob for Q&A if he's got any submissions there. That all of these are coming together in what people are seeing or perhaps talking about, or media is talking about, as a quote unquote Russian way of war. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted to complicate that idea that this is some sort of accepted or expected Russian way of war, as we wrap up. And since I'll be stepping out of the way afterwards, I'll thank you so very much for joining us, and throw that back to you there.
Yeah, thanks again for that question, Chad. I think that that one of the other ways, and I mentioned that just the difference in gender is what all I mentioned initially when you asked about the way an atrocity lens helps us to understand this, but the sexual-based crimes are both a harbinger of atrocity and an atrocity themselves. And so it tells you something about the crimes if they're, in particular, if mass rape of both men and women is happening in the course of the conflict. Because in addition to what you already discussed, it's a method of terrorizing, and it's a method of creating the division between us and them, in a way that is, wars can happen, people can shoot each other from one side to the other, but they understand that they're doing so for purposes of state. But when mass rape happens, it becomes something that is so profoundly searing on the victims and their families and their friends, that it becomes something that creates bright lines where in some cases there are not. And so that's one of the reasons that you saw it so widespread in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and you're seeing it to some extent in, hopefully not to the same extent, but there are more than enough reports otherwise that indicate that there is a significant amount of sexual assault and rape that is actually occurring in Ukraine. But it creates it terrorizes. It's meant to create kind of that existential difference between us and them that Putin is trying to construct. And so there's almost an imperative of state to actually do something like that. Now, is that a Russian way of war? I'm always hesitant to use a term like that, because I don't want this to be seen as some kind of trans-historical process, or to be to impugn a whole group of people, many of whom are adamantly opposed to the behavior of the Russian armed forces in Russia, who are Russian themselves. And so I'm not a Russian military historian either. So I think it is that any time you see something like this, it's a learned tendency. It's socialized. It's something that is part because of the training, because of the procurement, because of who's doing what, because of the command decisions. All of these contribute to an environment, and because of the impunity, as we just mentioned, to an environment that that makes these kinds of things more likely or less likely. And in the case of the war in Ukraine, I think that that you've seen continuity of tactics over time. I don't know if we've seen like mass rape being practiced by Russians on the ground in Syria, but we've seen behavior like this in Chechnya. We've seen there's enough lack of accountability, enough reward for this, and the real fact is just lack of punishment. That if right at this point there's almost a how would I describe it? The Russians can't afford to punish their troops for that kind of behavior, because it might actually really limit the number of people that then are able to fight. And so they have created a situation that almost reproduces itself because of the situation that they've put themselves in. There's, so I wouldn't, again, I'm hesitant to say Russian way of war, but I am more than willing to say that the context that they have created through the rhetoric, through the planning, through their procurement, their execution, their training, all of those things have created a situation where rape is much more likely in the case of the Russian military.
Well, thanks so much, David. We just have a couple minutes left, and I got a couple questions. One, I think you answered pretty extensively already about the rewards or the incentives for committing atrocities. So I'm going to ask one final question, and I think this might be a good way to wrap up. Craig Browdy asks, how does one bring a conflict with atrocities to an end? Sounds like the only option is total destruction of their ability to fight. What would you advise President Biden if you wanted to bring this type of behavior and this war in general to an end?
Well, I think that our folks have actually done a pretty good job thinking about this, and a pretty good job of applying the concepts from atrocity prevention, in particular by what I would call pre-bunking, right? We announced in advance that the Russians were doing false flag operations. We knew that, again, there's aside from rape, the other way you create kind of this existential world, this black and white world, is you charge genocide is occurring. And the argument that Putin made initially is that he needed to go to war in order to prevent a genocide of Russian speakers in Ukraine. And we pre-bunked that, and we basically said that, you know, we know that you're using this rhetoric purposely, and that's just not happening. Now, how do we stop it? Well, I'm a believer in accountability. The only way we're going to stop it is actually by holding people accountable. Unfortunately, generally legal answers to these types of questions are always post facto, and they are long-term. And so we have made progress, as I said. The way we fought in World War II, even how we, the US, fought in World War II is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to us. It's not acceptable to most of the international community anymore. And so we've had to make changes, and we have had to act better to preserve life off of the battlefield, and to prevent suffering or excessive suffering on the battlefield. That said, we are still, no one is happy with the situation. No one is content. And how to stop this? Really, it has to be there's a few options. Number one would be a outright loss of the war by Russia. Number two would be regime change in Russia that then holds the people who planned and organized and fought this war accountable. Number three is the idea that that there is some international accountability, but again, that's what we're trying to do. That's because we see that as the most likely outcome. And to answer your question with maybe on an unhelpful note, there are very few wars that we have fought recently that have ended. So the Korean War is still, in theory, just an armistice. Generally, when atrocities are occurring, some of the most recent research says they only stop when the perpetrator decides they're no longer worth committing, and that they've accomplished whatever their strategic goals are. So that could be the case if there's a redefinition of the strategic goals in Russia that says, well, you know what, we'll be happy with X, and it's a withdrawal of some form, and the Ukrainians are willing to abide by that. But as long as the war is going on, I don't see these atrocities stopping. And in fact, the worse the situation gets for the Russian military, the higher the risk gets, I think, that more atrocities will occur.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Frey. Thank you, Dr. Gibbs, for organizing. Hope that everyone enjoyed and learned something. And again, thank you.
Right, and if anyone has further questions, you're welcome to provide my email. And thank you both for your time as well.